This is the Inclusivity EQ podcast with Saul Gomez, the show that takes you around the world to share interviews with some of the most successful and relevant people on the planet. Hear their stories and get the most important business lessons they've learned on their road to success, and get exclusive access on how to implement their success into your life and business. The Inclusivity EQ podcast is brought to you by the Strategic Advisor Board and your host, Saul Gomez.
Welcome, everyone, to the Inclusivity EQ podcast, where we explore the power of inclusion across various industries. I'm your host, Saul Gomez, and in today's episode, we're diving into the essence of inclusion at the intersection of procedural justice. And to guide us through this discussion, we have a special guest, Dr. Orion Welch, a retired Navy commander, a combat veteran, an expert in organizational change and functionality with an emphasis in procedural justice and team building. And of course, someone I have the distinct pleasure and honor to call friend and brother in arms. Welcome, Dr. Welch.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm glad to have you. Dr. Welch, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background and how you got to where you are now.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to be here. My journey started many moons ago. I was a street kid coming out of New York who was a dreamer, believed in my dreams, and I took a chance and enlisted in the military, and the military gave me some really great opportunities to educate myself, to travel around the world, and to change my direction in life. I had an opportunity to get a commission, to be a naval aviator, to retire from the military, and to figure out life on the other side. I've done a lot of work with organizations and organizational change and leadership and management. Done a lot of program management with STEM involved programs, but I really don't necessarily proclaim that I'm an expert of anything. I just like to say that I just like to walk the earth like a shaman and figure out life.
School of Hard Knocks, right?
Yeah, there you go.
That's awesome. Well, thanks for that. It's always insightful to hear, where people come from, especially, as veterans, what started our journeys. And I think a lot of times, more times than not, at least I find that there's a lot of similarities in our humble beginnings, right? We needed direction. We needed that structure. We needed that militaristic, regimen of some sort to kind of help shape us as young adults. And somewhere along the way, we find our path. So again, thanks for being here today. And I want to get into inclusion at the intersection of procedural justice, because I understand that's what your dissertation was in, correct?
Correct.
Okay, great. So before we get into the procedural justice piece, I'd like to know and get your perspective on inclusion. What does it mean to you? What does it look like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like?
That's a really good question. And certainly in today's political headwinds, inclusion is being blown in so many different directions under many different guises, from DEI to, different names, to ideas, to fair, to whatever you want to call it. But inclusion is just making sure that everyone feels welcome, valued and respected, no matter who they are or where they come from. To me, inclusion is just a collection of all types of people, all types of things, all types of ideas as well, and just treating them all fairly and equally.
No, I like that. I like that you said, right, you didn't just, it wasn't myopic at all, right? You talked about different ideas, different thoughts. And there's always controversy, right? At least in my practice, in my field, that when we say inclusion or when we use the words DEI, people automatically tend to gravitate to race and gender, but it's so much more than that, right? And especially when you talk about inclusion, it's including folks that you otherwise wouldn't necessarily consider, right? Like HR folks and IT folks. They speak the same language, but very differently, right? HR folks speak very differently to a degree, right, than IT folks. Some folks are more, about pleasantries at first, and then other folks are more about get to the point, right? And so I think being inclusive of all those things, right, different skill sets, different thoughts, different expertise, different levels of education, I think that's where the gold is a lot of times, and I think there's a lot of missed opportunities in that regard.
I completely agree. I think if you consider our country a melting pot of many different cultures, if you just look at the basics of inclusion beyond color, before you even get to color, let's just say that, you can have a difference of opinion, beliefs, attitudes, the way they grew up, from a person from the Pacific Northwest and a person from the Southeast, right? They have different, but you put them together, you have to be inclusive of their voices and their experiences to make this thing work, to make this democracy work. And I think that inclusion is way beyond color. And a lot of people just get stuck on the color piece of inclusion.
Right. No, absolutely. And the thing that comes to mind, right, when I think about inclusion is relevance, right? When I include you, if you are, for example, if I'm from the South and you're from the from the Pacific Northwest, by including you, I gain some perspective on Pac Northwesterners, right? And now I can be more relevant. I can resonate with them. And if we're talking in the business world, well, guess what? I can tap into that market as well, right? And so I think there's value in really harnessing the power of inclusion. Now let's get into procedural justice, because I have all kinds of thoughts about that and what comes to mind. But I want to hear from you. I want to know what is procedural justice, in general, and at the intersection of inclusion, how do those two meld, or how do those two things interact?
Okay, fundamentally, procedural justice concerns the fairness and transparency of processes, by which decisions are made. Mm-hmm. Now, I say that because procedural justice applies to politics, it applies to medical care, it applies to the justice system, it applies to law enforcement, it applies to just about everything that we do when people come together. Right. And then we know that people coming together, there should be that foundation of inclusion. Right. Mm-hmm. So I think that inclusion is the elixir for procedural justice. Right. Inclusion is also the elixir for strong democracy that we could talk about as well. Now, when it refers to law enforcement, procedural justice is the idea that fairness, revolves around, particularly disputes, right? You're being stopped by a police officer. Procedural justice is not a practice, let me just tell you that, but it's a philosophy and a movement which promotes positive organizational change, and it upholds police legitimacy in the community, and it enhances safety for all, not just for police officers, but for the individuals as well that are involved into a police investigation, if you will. Mm-hmm. Now, procedural justice focuses on the way that police and other legal authorities interact with the public, and how the characteristic of those interactions, shape the public's view of the police. So for every positive exchange that you have with procedural justice, consider it a deposit in the bank of trust, especially when it's viewed by the community members. Now, procedural justice is broken down into 4 pillars, right? There's your dignity and respect. There's giving your subjects a voice. There's being fair and impartial. And there's also being transparent and trustworthy, right? So imagine, you can think of all the other police issues that came across the national news dealing with a lot of Black men. Take George Floyd, take the gentleman in Memphis, take some of the African-American members in the community down in Louisiana and Mississippi, and some of the things that has happened to them. Now imagine if procedural justice was applied there. Imagine if that philosophy took root there. You probably wouldn't have had these instances. They probably would have been avoided. Because imagine, hold on 1 second. Oh, geez. Imagine procedural justice. If you're driving and you get pulled over, right? Mm-hmm. What procedural justice looks like is, hey, sir, I saw you ran this red light. I just want to make sure that you are okay, right? Do you have an emergency? Is there anything that I can assist you with? That's the first thing, right? Hey, I'm not assuming the worst. I'm not assuming you did such a bad thing, but I want you to know that you ran a red light, and I'm giving you an opportunity to voice what is going on with you. But in the process, I'm also treating you with dignity and respect, right? And I'm going to be fair. So I'm going to say, hey, here's my video of you running a red light. Or you could respond by saying, well, I thought I had it, but no, sir. The light was clearly red when you ran it. Unfortunately, I have to enforce the law here. But when I include you in that process, and I include you in include your voice in that process, regardless of the outcome, you're going to be okay, right? You may not like that. Oh, I got a ticket that I'm going to have to pay.
Right.
But the reality is you're going to be okay. You're going to walk away from that exchange being like, well, at least I got to say what I needed to say, and you're going to be better off. And there's going to be a little bit of trust between us. You may not necessarily like me because I gave you a ticket, but at least you trust that I'm doing my job and doing the right thing by you.
Let me back up a little bit, and I'm glad you said that. I want to back up a little bit to the very beginning when you talked about procedural justice is not a practice, it's a philosophy. Can you expound on that a little bit?
Right. So there's nothing on the books that says you must do this, right? You step A, when you meet interview someone who's potentially have a infraction breaking the law, you got to treat them with dignity and respect, right? There's nothing on the books that says you have to do this. But you and I were both raised in the same era, and we know that you get more bees with honey, right? And so especially if you want to legitimize and strengthen police legitimacy especially in communities of color, you're going to have to start with being respectful, right? And just like you would be respectful to anybody else, you have to be fair across the board.
Right. Absolutely. It's as you're saying that, I'm thinking, well, how does inclusion, you mentioned that inclusion is the elixir of procedural justice, right? So how does that interplay, right? If procedural justice isn't necessarily a practice but a philosophy, right? That it's what I call one of those intangibles. How does inclusion tie into that?
So procedural justice is all. I think inclusion is certainly the foundation of procedural justice, because think about it, right? When you especially want to give your subject a voice, when you want to be fair and impartial, these are all things that really are kind of describing inclusion as well.
Right.
Hey, I'm saying that what you have to offer into this discussion is just as important. Yes, I have to adjudicate and I have to make the final decision. However, I do want to include your voice. You do have a part to play in this, right? So, it is the impetus in which everything kind of grows from procedural justice. It's what's going to bind strong relationships and kind of make things happen in the community between.
When I think about that, right? As a Hispanic male, right? As a person of color, growing up in South Central LA, I remember getting pulled over, right? And I always would think, I didn't always have bad interactions, but the times that I did have bad interactions with law enforcement officials, I always thought, like, man, how come they can't see it from my perspective, right? And I think that's where, for me, where inclusion, right, comes in. Where am I being inclusive of somebody else's perspective? Am I, in my mind, right, if I'm a law enforcement officer and I'm pulling over a person of color, am I being inclusive of the lens that they're seeing life through, right? Because I can't tell you how many times a cop has said, why are you so nervous? Do you have something to hide? And I'm thinking, like, you're already criminalizing me. I'm nervous because historically, right, people of color haven't always had the best experiences with law enforcement. So that's always in my mind. So yes, I'm going to be nervous. I want to make sure my P's and Q's and my T's are crossed and my I's are dotted. But I always think, like, why couldn't he understand my perspective? Well, he or she doesn't walk in my shoes. So for me, inclusion is being able to take that perspective, right? Being inclusive of somebody else's perspective, because that's going to govern and drive how I engage. I learned that, as a leader in the military, I can't have one unilateral leadership style. I have to adjust to whatever's in front of me so that I can maximize the potential of my talent pool. In the case of procedural justice and law enforcement, to me, it's how can I make this experience a positive one, right? I'm not trying to criminalize someone because they were speeding or ran a red light, but hey, it's more of a safety thing. I'm not here to police you and come down on you, right? How do I make that interaction more pleasant and walk away having a good experience with law enforcement? And that's kind of how I think about inclusion in procedural justice.
You know what? You and I park our cars in the same garage, right? Because you hit the nail on the head. And the more inclusive you are with procedural justice, the stronger relationships you're going to build and the more cooperation you're going to get from people, right? That teamwork to move towards a goal, whether it's to make a community safe from a law enforcement perspective, or if you apply it to the workforce, whether it's to ensure that everyone has a seat at the table and has contribution to, completing a program.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you said that, right? Because that kind of bridges into, okay, we talked about law enforcement. And to be quite frank with you, right? When I heard procedural justice, I thought law enforcement. I thought legal. I thought a judge, a jury, an attorney. And so, so my mind went there. Talk about biases, right? That's just my lived experience.
Absolutely.
However, when we talk about procedural justice, I think to your point, it extends beyond that, right? Into the workplace, into corporate, into government, into so many different aspects of the work that we do, whether it's white collar work or blue collar work. So can you talk a little bit about procedural justice within the context of inclusion outside of law enforcement?
Sure.
You say, organization or mom and pop company.
So let's take, let's look at today's political landscapes, right? And things that are going on that we see, hotbed issues, right? With politics. And, in regards to inclusion and procedural justice, think about the issue of voter suppression or voter rights. Is that being inclusive? Right? When you're trying to suppress the vote to give yourself an advantage from one party to the next.
Mm-hmm.
Is it inclusive when, and I'll say this from a political thing, and I know this is not a political platform, and I'm not going to stand on a soapbox, but is it inclusive when a woman's reproduction rights are taken away? She gets to make the choice on what she deems is best for her body and her, what's going on in her life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that really inclusive when you have a room full of older white gentlemen who may not have the perspective of a woman who's in college and who's trying to get ahead or just had one of those off nights or whatever it is, right? That's not being inclusive. That's not the procedural justice when you say, here's the lay of the land, but I'm going to go do what I want to do anyway on the back end because I'm a politician and what I say is go, I write the laws kind of thing.
Well, it's trying to strike a balance, in perspectives, right? Perspective taking.
Sure.
I might feel one way about this. Somebody might feel some way about it, but are we at least considering, right, both sides or all three sides or all four sides, however many sides there are? And I think to that point, right, as you're kind of talking about that, I remember, especially in the military, right, when you talk about procedural justice, where some people get awarded, right, because in the military, unless you're going to court martial, you're not disciplined, right? You don't get in trouble. You're awarded restriction. You're awarded, a reduction in rank or pay or whatever, right? Same behavior, different outcomes, and sometimes it's not even about race. It's about the relationships that people have with those in power to adjudicate, right, a discrepancy in behavior, or when somebody wants to apply for a program. Oh, well, you need to go to so and so because they'll give you the inside scoop. Well, why can't there be a policy or procedure that gives you a checklist so that everyone, right, can partake and have that same opportunity? And I don't mean it from an equal opportunity standpoint, but inclusivity, right? Everyone should have the same opportunity. And to me, it starts with inclusion. And I can't tell you how many times I can count, or recall times when that's happened where, you have to know somebody, you have to know the right people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, completely agree. That's where the term your C daddy comes in, right? Because these are the people that are going to sponsor you to these higher positions, not necessarily based on your talent or your work ethic, but it is largely based on, hey, I'm at the O Club with you, every Friday, and we're going golfing, and we're this and we're that. Again, that is that's anti-inclusion,
Right.
because there's people out there that's trying to do the right thing. And I've seen it in my time. You take a DUI, DWI, that's the kiss of death, right? So I've seen people get it and pay for it dearly with their careers. I've seen people get it and have it swept under the rug, right? So here's where procedural justice comes in, right? It is fair and being impartial across the board. Unfortunately, again, it's, it didn't necessarily apply the way that it should. And that's why I say procedural justice applies to everything, as well as inclusion. And as I mentioned to you early in the beginning of this, inclusion is the elixir for a strong democracy, right? Because imagine, if our politicians, our representatives who's supposed to be the best of us, are respectful towards each other, are inclusive of each other, we probably wouldn't be dealing with a lot of the issues that we're having right now, unfortunately.
Well, I think you get into the nuances of, I can include you, I can give you a seat at the table, I can even give you a talking piece, but am I really valuing what you have to say? Am I giving you the actual genuine platform? Or am I saying, okay, Dr. Welch, thank you very much, noted, next, right? Or am I saying, hey, you know what? Let's talk about that. Let's unpack that a little bit. Let's have a one-on-one and talk after this, because I want to know more about that. That's an interesting perspective you bring. I think there's a difference, right? Yeah. And so I think it matters what inclusion looks like, especially when it comes to procedural justice, because you can say, check in the block, you had an opportunity, but did you have access to it? Were you included in the town hall? Were you included in the sidebar conversations that gave those sidebar participants an edge?
So inclusion, another way to put it, inclusion is a room that have doors of many opportunities, right? Mm-hmm. It has doors of procedural justice that you just mentioned. It has a psychological safety door too, right? Because inclusion can create, if done right, an environment of psychological safety. And that's Absolutely. Key in the performance of a lot of organizations.
Absolutely.
And you have that triadic reciprocity between psychological safety, procedural justice, and inclusion. They all impact each other.
You hit the nail on the head. I think that really resonates with me, because it really, really highlights the tangible benefits of not only valuing but prioritizing inclusivity, being inclusive, right? And I think that's just, you just hit the nail on the head. I really resonate with that a lot. We'll take a quick break. I want to do a quick plug to Strategic Advisory Board, SAB. They are, the sponsors of this platform, and SAB is a great organization. They help small businesses or businesses in general scale their businesses, grow them, whether it's marketing, strategy build-up, pipeline development. Strategic Advisory Board is there for business owners of all sorts to help build success within their companies. So look them up, Strategic Advisory Board. Thank you very much for sponsoring this platform and this podcast. Now back to you, Dr. Welch. We were talking about earlier about C Daddy and C, right? We both kind of share the same background with Navy. So I understand you have kind of a case study, right? Let's delve into a real world example, or as we call them in the Navy, right? A C story that you have to share with us. Tell me about that.
So, on a basis of inclusion, I worked, I've seen good organizations. I've seen some not so good organizations, or organizations that can do a lot better. Right. I worked with a senior officer who was not inclusive, right? He had a homogeneous approach, right? If you didn't look like me, if you didn't do the things that I like, then you were going to be on the B team and not the A team, right? And that divided a ready room full of officers who otherwise wanted to come together to learn and to be excellent. Each individual, brought a lot to the table. For example, we had a kid who was really into religion, and he wasn't ashamed to show it, but he was good at his job. He wasn't socially awkward, but yet he was excluded because of that. You had different kids from different parts of the country who were probably more to themselves and not necessarily wanted to do a lot of the things that the senior officer wanted to do, and they were excluded. So it really broke the organization. Unfortunately, the organization didn't live up to its potential of what it could be. And a lot of people were affected by it. I think that we missed an opportunity to be great, but it was a learning lesson for everyone, and especially those who stayed around to go on to bigger and better things on what the importance of inclusion is to a military fighting unit.
No, absolutely, because you talk about that. I think about in groups and out groups, right? And depending on in the community that you're in, especially when you start talking about tip of the sphere type of units, it could mean the difference between life and death.
Absolutely.
Because at that point, information, intelligence, access, all those things become important. If you're not being included about it, if the procedures aren't inclusive, they're not, you don't have procedural justice in how we do things, it could cause people harm, right? And even death. So I think, when we talk about in the Navy, maritime superiority, I think it's imperative that we have a sense of what inclusion is and what it isn't. Because, we can go on so many different tangents. And I think about, when we talk about inclusivity, are we truly talking about including people, or are we talking about assimilating people? And those are two different things, right? Assimilating is you have to act like me, talk like me, look like me, dress like me. But if we're doing that, what does that say about the diversity that individuals bring? If we're not being inclusive of their differences. Yeah, we're all similar, right? We have the military background, or we all work in IT, we all work in tech, we all work in science, medical field. But we each bring our own uniqueness, right? Our own individuality that adds to that pool of meaning. And so I think it's important to discern and understand the difference between inclusivity and assimilation.
I completely agree. I think the long arc of inclusion is that it builds trust too, right?
Absolutely.
That's another door that we can go through.
When it's genuine, right? When it's authentic.
Yeah, absolutely. It builds trust. And as you said, in the military fighting unit, you need trust that this person is going to do their job and do it well, especially when there's lives on the line.
Absolutely.
When you don't have an environment of inclusion, when you are separating people because of their differences, then you're going to create animosity. You're going to create people who are not going to be willing to give their all in a time where it's really needed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And to kind of dovetail into that, for our listeners out there, looking for or eager to implement inclusive practices into their organization, and specifically, right, when it comes to procedural justice, what are some actionable steps they can take that you would suggest?
Inclusion in regards to procedural justice, I would say really take a deep look within and do a lot of reflection, right? Because we're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. We all make mistakes, but reflect on those times when you could have done a better job in regards to inclusion and being fair across the board, right? So I can think about times when I wasn't fair on something, right? Because I was in my feelings, in my emotion. My emotional EQ, my EQ was low, right?
Right.
But you have to learn how to build on it. You have to strive to when it comes to inclusion specifically and being fair, don't just do the best that you can do. Do it the best that it could ever be done, right? Because people really depend on that. They depend on you and the leadership. They depend on having a fair shot at whatever it is that they're trying to aspire to be. So be open-minded as a leader. I think, approach it every situation with empathy and listen more than you speak. And that goes a long way and implementing the building blocks of inclusion, psychological safety, procedural justice, and trust, and a whole host of other things.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's so insightful. I'm gonna have to write that one down. You said, "Don't do the best that you can do. Do it the best that it can ever be done." Right, and to do that, right, we can't do it alone. We need a team,
Absolutely.
And for that, we need inclusivity.
Absolutely, completely agree. Because when you have inclusivity, you have excellence, and when you have excellence, people will never forget you. Right? That is your brand. People will never. I remember when I worked for this command, and it was excellent. It was excellence because it was inclusive. There was inclusivity.
Fantastic insights, Dr. Welch. Indeed, right? Inclusion, and when we're talking about procedural justice, it's not a destination, right? It's a continuous journey that evolves in this ever evolving and changing landscape that we find ourselves in. And before we wrap up, I just wanted to say that one, thank you. I learned a little bit more about procedural justice, and especially at the intersection of inclusion. Mm-hmm. And to that point, what projects do you have going on? What are you working on right now that are of interest to you? And how can people get a hold of you if they want to know more?
Well, I love to work on people-centric projects, things that empower people to do their best work. I'm going to kind of keep a tight lip on some of the things that I'm doing, but it's coming soon. And trust me, I'll share with the world for sure. But if anyone wants to contact me, talk about whatever or anything that they heard here, you can reach me on LinkedIn at Orion P. Welch on LinkedIn, or if you want to email me, orionp20@gmail.com. I'll be more than happy to sit down and share ideas. I may not agree with you on an idea, but one thing I'm not going to do is make you feel uncomfortable for sharing, because that's important. I'm always looking to grow and learn. And you know what? You may offer a perspective that is just completely out of this world, but it may make me think a little bit, differently in regards to my approaches and reflections in life.
Awesome. Well, I feel a little bit cheated that you're not sharing and you're being tight-lipped. So we're going to have to bring you back so you can share it with the world. That way they can say they heard it first on the Inclusivity EQ podcast.
Absolutely.
So can I get that commitment? You'll come back and share that with us?
You got it. I'm there for you. Awesome. Just say the word.
Thanks, Dr. Welch. Any final thoughts to our listeners?
No, I think that you thank you for this opportunity to kind of to chop it up and share some ideas. I think that what people could really, really walk away is just bake inclusion, inclusivity, procedural justice, trust, bake that into your everyday bread of life. It's not just with law enforcement in regards to procedural justice, right? It's everything that we do. So bake that into your daily bread of life and be a good human being.
Awesome. Wise words from a very wise man. Thank you, Dr. Welch, and thank you for our listeners for joining us on another day today at the Inclusivity EQ podcast. Remember, inclusion knows no bounds. It's the key to unlocking the full potential of every industry. Dr. Welch, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, and please share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag the Inclusivity Podcast. Until next time, stay tuned, stay open-minded, stay curious, and keep building your own Inclusivity EQ. I'm your host, Saul Gomez, signing off. Catch you on the flip side. Out here.
Thanks for listening to the Inclusivity EQ podcast with Saul Gomez. Please leave your feedback and visit strategicadvisorboard.com to get the latest and greatest business advisement on the planet. Follow us on social media for updates, and we will see you on the next episode.